Welcome, Bill Kelly.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to join you.
Now, Bill, you're a fellow of the American Academy of Housing and Communities. So tell us a bit about your experience with the Academy.
Well, I think the Academy is a tremendous innovation. There was a gap in the history of housing and community development, and Kent stepped forward to fill it. Kent Watkins, and I think he's just done a spectacular job. So it's been a combination of creation of regular lunches with fellows of the Academy speaking, also a website, gathering lots and lots of documents, holding events. For example, the 50th anniversary of HUD generated an event, and the retirement of a senior HUD official generated another event. And then there are these oral histories that we're so lucky to have you doing, which build out the whole idea and the history of of housing and community development, at least since the Department of HUD was formed back in 1968.
Since Carla Hills, you work for, former Secretary of HUD, has been a guest on Community Trailblazers, let's just explore the point in your career with HUD. In the mid-70s, Secretary Hills had really quite a challenge, one of the biggest being the implementation of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. The reputation of HUD needed some work as well. So can you tell us a little bit about those years at HUD?
Sure. You summarized the big picture very nicely. The affordable housing programs of HUD two of them were suspended by the Nixon administration in January of '73. And then the administration and Congress worked together to create this Housing and Community Development Act of 1974, which was signed into law in August of '74, I believe. And it had a deadline of January of '75 for the program, the new Section 8 housing assistance program to be in operation. When Carla got to HUD in March of '75, not only hadn't regulations been written and issued, but there was really no effective timetable for when they would come out. All that had left the Congress extremely unhappy. We had housing benefited from having a very good set of interested and knowledgeable people in Congress at that point, and a lot of bipartisanship, but they were throwing their hands up because HUD wasn't performing. The old programs had been canceled, the new one had been authorized, and it wasn't yet in effect. And what's HUD doing over there? How do we move them along? So what happened was that they were calling hearings left and right. Carla ended up testifying, time after time before House and Senate appropriations and authorization committees, and was, subjected to lots of fairly nasty criticism. She was the messenger, not the cause, but she was the messenger. So she really had to figure out, and the rest of us with her, how to turn this around. So with her strong legal background and her very straightforward approach to life and issues, she basically concluded she needed to set some goals and some deadlines and some dates, track performance against those, re-engage and motivate the demoralized staff, and reestablish HUD's credibility and reputation on the Hill and in the press and with the industry. So it was a daunting task, and it had to. This is sort of like designing the plane as you're flying it. I mean, you're trying to hold Congress off because you do intend to do it and you will get it done, but you're not able to produce the proof quite yet. Other examples of the problem were just the delay that everything underwent at HUD. So, for example, congressional correspondence, letters to the secretary, personal letters to the secretary from members of Congress were taking an average of 45 days to be answered. Many of those queries required, much faster action than that. They wouldn't be writing to the secretary, and they would be sending one of their staff people over to HUD instead to try to sort it out. So that was another source of a terrible reputation. HUD was missing deadlines that had been set by Congress for the submission of various annual reports. It was just really looked like a place where nothing was happening. Meanwhile, there was a strong, career staff, but it just had to be organized, motivated, and move forward. So that was the really big challenge that Carla faced, and the rest of us who were supporting her in the effort. The regulatory process got moving quickly. Deadlines were set, and the regs were produced, and HUD produced 470,000 reservations for funding for apartments in fiscal year 1976, which benefited from an extra quarter because it was a shift from fiscal year at that point. So she really pulled that off very effectively, and that was the main, I suppose, main accomplishment of the Hills administration at HUD, and that program survives today, and much longer lasting than just about any other program that HUD ever had. In addition to dealing with that specific problem, there were many other issues and opportunities, and one of them was around around systems. So one of the systems that was clearly broken at HUD beyond the mail system was the regulatory system. And what would happen is that someone in a program office would draft a regulation, and it would be circulated to the general counsel's office, and then to the policy office, and then to this office and that office. And then somewhere along the line, somebody would have an objection, and they'd rewrite it, and it'd go back to the program office, and it just was in this sort of permanent circling of clearance process. So one of the things we did was to create a little regulations office, which was staffed by a former Justice Department lawyer with, I think, 2 or 3 people in it. But as soon as the need for a regulation or a report was identified, that office would set up a schedule and would call for set deadlines for different pieces, and would circulate drafts simultaneously to all the offices and expect them back by a certain date, and would try to resolve issues between subparts of HUD so that the regulations would could be sent up to the secretary for review and signature. And if there was a really serious policy issue, the issue could be brought to me or to the secretary, depending on how level of seriousness it was, for resolution. And so things were no longer bogged down in the process of issuing regulations in the department from that point forward. For the correspondence, we set up a little chart and listed for each by assistant secretary, identified when correspondence was referred, tracked it, saw how many were, set a deadline of 7 days, and distributed at the meeting of the senior staff, the assistant secretaries, sort of the report card. And it's a gold star for people that had answered all their correspondence, and a bottleneck for anybody that was seriously behind, and that produced some real response and responsiveness. So there were lots of systems like that that needed tending if the department was going to carry out all of its activities. There was a system called the Goals Management System that was run by a fellow named Bob Wallace, which was really critical in all this process, because it was the way the secretary and the assistant secretaries negotiated with the different offices in the beginning of a new year, and had numerical goals in it, which was a real innovation at HUD. And the reports were tracked, and then the reports were actually relied on in the review process of how the office was performing and so on. So we ended up with with a clear accountability track, setting goals and tracking them, and that produced some real responsiveness on the part of the staff. I mean, I think the reflecting on it, the issue, the most important thing was that the staff needed direction and support. There was a really quite high quality staff at the time, and it was just a question of how to motivate them.
Well, if I remember right, we were also in the Nixon moratorium at that point.
Right.
And we had just also been coming out of Watergate.
Yes, yeah, and the moratorium played into the unhappiness about the slow implementation of the Section 8 program, because it meant there was no basically private subsidized housing that was being built or rehabbed during that period. So yes, the turmoil with Watergate played out at HUD, but before really Carla went there, and certainly before I got there. Carla came in March and I came in June of '75, and President Ford had taken the helm back in the summer of '74. So I shouldn't let this whole interview go by without really praising his way of doing business. I mean, he was very, like Carla, he was very direct and very open. And so I remember that when we put together a budget, there would be disagreements between HUD and the Office of Management and Budget over various requests for appropriations. And I remember that one night I spent with the Associate Director of OMB for agencies that included HUD, and we spent the whole night boiling down the long list of points of disagreement into short, agreed upon statements of the issue. And then Secretary and the Director of OMB, with us, tagging along, talked to the President about these issues, and he resolved them. He made his decisions, and it was just a whole different world from today's governance, which is so heavily run by the White House staff and by politics. So in any event.
And that was President Ford, right?
President Ford, right, right.
Mm-hmm. Right. I actually was involved in the implementation of some of that because we were one of the very first housing authorities. I was executive director back in 1975, 76. I think we got our first funding of certificates.
Really? Great. Yeah. Well, and where was that?
That was in Dakota County, Minnesota.
Ah, okay. Well, I'm from Minnesota. I know where Dakota County is, and so that's
you do.
Right. So yeah, no, that was there were a lot of other things being done. I keep focusing on Section 8 because that's where the big money is. But the Community Development Block Grant Program was also included in the 1974 legislation, and so that had to be implemented. That seemed to be more under control, a lot simpler, because the concept of the block grant was to pass the most of the decision making down to the states and cities that received allocations. But nevertheless, there's a lot going on.
That piece of legislation probably had more impact on housing than any other piece I can even think of.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I guess the only competitor these days might be the low-income housing tax credit, which,
right.
Because of how long it's persisted, it's produced an awful lot of housing. But
and is the only thing today, if you're going to be building housing, that you can really rely on.
Yeah, exactly. The one really entertaining story, I think, about my time at HUD was that I was working on active duty in the Secretary of the Navy's office. And after 2 years of that, I was really getting tired of it, both of the work and of the Secretary's personality, frankly. So I found a job for myself in the Pentagon's internal think tank, its Policy and Planning Office. I was told that the Secretary thought that was inappropriate because I would be going from a Secretary's office, a Secretary of the Navy's office, to a mere staff office. Even though, of course, that office had much more clout than the Secretary of the Navy did. But in any event, so I asked myself, how do I come up with another plan? So I heard some wonderful things about Carla from some people that had practiced law in Los Angeles. So I got in touch with her, and she decided to hire me. So I was able to take that letter, which I drafted, over to the Navy, and the Secretary was perfectly happy to let me go to a cabinet officer's office, because that didn't somehow demean his status. For in any event, it was. And then 2 weeks later, Senator Proxmire, who then chaired the Housing Committee, issued a press release that identified 15 Pentagon minions that had been placed in policy jobs at civilian agencies, and I was on that list. This was about the time it was done within the first month that I was at HUD. I went over to HUD on active duty, and I was on the list. I was. They called the General Counsel of the Defense Department, called me up, and whom I worked with, and said, if you want to make the Navy a career, we'll stand behind it and take the heat. But if not, we'll let you go. So I finished my Navy time, went to HUD, doubled my salary, and because I had gone over there on active duty, I never had to go through the White House Personnel Office, which would have quickly identified my lifelong Democratic credentials. So, in any event, that's my story.
And it's so interesting how
and that's how I became interested in housing. I had no prior housing background, like Carla. I was essentially no housing background, and went there and then loved it.
it's always interesting to me how a decision, an important decision like that, can take you one direction or another and affects the rest of your life.
Yes, it does. It has, and I'm forever grateful to Carla for giving me that opportunity. So.
Well, once you left HUD, then you went over to the law firm, and did you stay in affordable housing there, or did you do something else?
Well, I was uncomfortable going over to HUD for many years because I had the way things played out, having to work with a whole lot of the senior career staff on a variety of different policy and other issues, and I was really representing the Secretary, so I had quite a bit of authority, and I just didn't feel that it was appropriate to go back over there. I practiced in a whole variety of areas, from synthetic fuel finance to creation of national parks to retrieval of spacecraft that went into the wrong orbit by Hubble, to all kinds of oddball projects. But to stay involved in housing at the invitation of Cushing Dolbear, who was the founder of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, I joined the board and became the treasurer, and we worked together extensively, but not doing any advocacy. I wasn't doing any advocacy at HUD as part of that. So it was a nice way to stay on top of what's going on, to meet one of my life heroes and work with her, and to be ready to go back in later. So maybe in 1982 or 3, I started to represent some nonprofit affordable housing developers in some HUD policy issues and in using old tax law to refinance some of their older housing properties. And that was really my first foray into the housing work at the law firm. And that led to a lot of the other things I did later on. For one thing, I learned really how sort of scaled, effective, and business-like some of these affordable housing nonprofits are. And I really got a sense of what their capacities were and their ability to take on much more than they were doing at the time. Many more properties, many more programs, and so on. So that was a really good way to get introduced, and it also fit my sort of policy predilections. So it was a good start. It was still only a small part of my practice, but it was a beginning.
And you were concerned at the time, I think, that the tax credit legislation would be usable by nonprofit developers, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I worked a lot with Barry Zegas, who was Cushing's successor at the Low Income Housing Coalition, and Marilyn Melkonian, who's been on the kind of public interest side of affordable housing for her whole career. And we made the rounds on the Hill at all hours of the day and night. Very intensive effort. Worked closely with Senator Mitchell and Bobby Rosen, and so we were supportive of the whole credit idea, but we also wanted to make sure that the provisions were usable by nonprofits. And nonprofits had very little experience raising capital using old tax law. So we were really trying to spot the issues and try to make sure that at least as many as possible were covered by the tax credit legislation. So we ended up, in the legislation, there was a preservation period, a period in which the housing had to stay affordable at affordable rents to the right income group, and we ended up with a nonprofit set aside, which over time ended up being much less than the amount that the nonprofits used as they developed the expertise to work with the credit. But it was a way of making sure that they could come in at the beginning and participate.
Kind of get their foot in the door and get used. Get
their foot in the door, right? You get some experience and get people. I remember speaking many times at a group called what's now called the American Association of Homes and Services for the Aging. No, it's not anymore. It's changed its name. Was then called the American Association of Homes and Services for the Aging. Speaking to large groups of nonprofits, trying to explain, the complexities of some of this and to try to induce them to try to use the credit to build more housing. So getting nonprofits to be functioning at scale really was an important part of what I was trying to do and what was going on at the time. And
then in 1986, you co-created the National Affordable Housing Trust with the Retirement Housing Foundation and National Church Residences. So what was your objective in that?
Well, what led us to do it, what helped us spot the opportunity was that the brokerage houses and other syndicators of the tax credit it wasn't the tax credit, I'm sorry, this was the old tax law. So the brokers and the syndicators under the old tax law were charging 20+% fees to raise the capital. And what they were really selling, we learned in the course of the syndication process, was they were selling the capacity of the nonprofits to actually build and operate the properties. They weren't really doing anything magical. And so we decided that Clark Harshfield from Retirement Housing Foundation and eventually John Glenn from National Church Residences, who were the CEOs, and I talked through the idea of setting up a nonprofit intermediary to do this kind of thing, and then increase the amount of the capital that's raised to go into the properties, and then with any residual cash flow or profit, plow that back into the nonprofit housing sector. So it was almost a crisis to waste that amount of money and an opportunity to launch something new. So it has gone through several kind of recreations over the years, and has raised well in excess of $1 billion of tax credit capital, but also worked with developers to obtain the famous soft money from state and local government and other places that are necessary to close the gap between the money you can raise using the credit and the actual cost of the housing. So that was that group was originally those two, and then expanded to 4 or 5. Eventually became a dozen or so, and in maybe 2016 or so, the group we'll talk about in a minute became a parent company to the National Affordable Housing Trust. So the two of them were effectively merged in as a nonprofit syndicator and policy shop.
And you're probably talking about the other one that you co-created, the Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future, which is SAHF,
right,
and is pronounced SAFE. So what is the SAFE's mission?
Well, the SAFE's mission is really to facilitate the creation and preservation of affordable housing for people who of limited economic means who can't otherwise afford it. And so it's really a public policy. That's its public policy goal, and that's its business goal. And one of the strengths, I think, is that it aligns nearly perfectly with what most housing legislation is attempting to accomplish through government programs. And so it's a very strong, with a very strong mission alignment, there's an opportunity to become a trusted advisor to people on the Hill and at HUD to improve programs that are potentially more effective than they have been.
So has it been the success then that you envisioned?
Yeah, I think it really has, and it started. So let me just take you back to the origins for a second. So what really happened was that I was ready to leave the practice of law sometime soon, and my firm's retirement plan kind of forced me to stay till I was 55 or 6, and so but I was working on a bunch of HUD policy issues, and I would solve a problem, and it would end up being a waiver or some special exception or something for that property or that owner or something, and you put all the time and effort into making the policy case, and you end up solving the problem that lets the transaction go forward, but it isn't open to the broader community, and it doesn't have a measurable impact on the overall production and preservation and effectiveness of affordable housing. So the people I would do it for didn't really have the resources to hire a major law firm to kind of stick at these policy issues, and they really didn't but they remained interested in them. So what we did was to bring them together, and at the same time other nonprofit leaders in some of the scaled nonprofits were feeling they had no home, no policy home, no home for peer exchange. The trade associations that they encountered were basically dominated by for-profit developers, and the goals of the for-profit developers were to, not surprisingly and not wrongly, to make money building and operating affordable housing, but they weren't focused on preserving its affordability, over the long haul, and they weren't focused on as heavily on resident services, and so that was not a really good forum. And the nonprofit groups such as Enterprise and LISC, and for huge entities, were much more focused on the smaller startup nonprofits and trying to help them get organized and get small grants to studies on properties and so on. Whereas these nonprofits that I represented, and the additional ones that helped form the group, were looking for a bigger game. They wanted to do things at a larger scale, and they wanted to do them across the board. So that sort of confluence of insights and interests brought me and them together, and we added a few more and launched it. It's now, as you said in the introduction, has 13 members and about 150,000 affordable apartments.
So tell us how SAFE shifted to an emphasis on how affordable housing can serve as a platform for residents to achieve their goals.
Right. So for the first few years, our main focus was on policy issues, especially preservation issues, and on SAFE as a peer group, where the CEOs could sit around a room and trust one another and lay out their worst nightmares and biggest problems and brainstorm about how to solve them. After that level of trust was established, it seemed clear that SAFE could be a platform to start beginning some other program work. So we started with energy efficiency, and that program is still working effectively today. The members have achieved the goal they set in 2016 of reducing energy and water consumption by at least 20% by 2020. So that's been achieved, and it's, the work is moving on. But that started with the insight that you can't manage what you don't know, and so data gathering became a big piece of that, and we worked with a couple of startups actually with effective data companies to begin to collect the data. That work was incredibly hard, the data work, because every utility built things differently, and every building was different from one another, and so developing baselines and predictability, and then figuring out how to cost effectively reduce the consumption was really a huge undertaking, and it makes me really proud that it's still going on. This is almost 15 years later, and that it gets ever more sophisticated under my successors, and so there we are. So that's a long introduction to the answer to your question, which was in about 2008, 2009, we decided to take a look at whether we're really improving the lives of the residents beyond giving them shelter. And again, we thought data was critical, and again, we got foundation support and a lot of buy-in from the membership about gathering consistent data across the now 13 members. So we spent a lot of time trying to decide what those questions were, what data we wanted to gather, and how frequently and through what modes, and eventually developed 5 or 6 fields of data, and the members are still gathering it, and we have a data analyst who's reporting out on the findings, and all of that provides the kind of platform as on this energy conservation model for actually figuring out what the next steps are. So SAFE has been doing a lot of things. Started on my watch, but have grown magnificently since then. And last few years, they've worked very closely with the service coordinators who are funded by HUD in most properties, and most senior properties and some family properties. And their job is really to help the residents have access to other services beyond housing. But frankly, it often didn't work very effectively. The training wasn't there, the little healthcare exposure, lots of reasons why it wasn't as effective as it could be. And so again, working with the members and the data and their service coordinators and their service coordinator leaders, SAFE's been trying to improve the field, but also most importantly, to help improve the lives of the residents. So there are lots of different things going on under that housing as a platform umbrella, also including a lot of work with healthcare providers, trying to see what their limitations were, what their interest was. They have come clearly to know that housing is maybe the most important social determinant of health, but figuring out how under their regulatory structures and ours, and given tight budgets and so on, how they can most effectively work with us to try to improve the health and wellness of people living in the properties. But so it's hugely complicated topic because it covers so many different fields, and the rules are different and often conflicting. And I'll just give it one example of that because I'm focused on this right now. So if you live in an affordable housing property in Chicago, I won't mention the name of it, but the residents there send their kids to 50 different schools spread out all over the city of Chicago. There's a property in Miami that another SAFE member owned that had 400 or 500 residents they worked with a big national health group, to put together a plan for improving the health and wellness of the people in that property. But before they spent too much time on it, they wanted to see how many of their insured were living in this property. It turned out there were 5, and so that, so there are all these, people talk about the language issues, but there are all these structural sort of systems problems that are embedded in the different regimes that under which people of limited means get housing, healthcare, and education, leaving aside some other topics. But so it's a big challenge going forward. But I really credit the SAFE members and my successors for sticking with it, because it has to be done, and if it isn't done, we're going to keep in these silos, and we're not going to be able to even be cost effective in our impact on the residents, much less to really enable them to lead the kind of lives they want to live.
Well, clearly, you're a believer in co-creation for social change. What's that mean to you?
Okay, so this term is a fairly new term, but I think it's what we did in National Affordable Housing Trust and Stewards of Affordable Housing. We pulled together a bunch of the right people working for the right institutions, and we sort of start at the beginning. And we jointly create the ideas and the programs. So everybody has something to contribute, and they really do if you've selected the people right. And every program that you develop has buy-in from all those participants, and they also were involved in creating it. So when external circumstances change and it has to be modified, they all know what they did before and what they can do now to modify it to make it fit current circumstances. So it's a very flexible, effective way to work together, and it's different from one organization developing a policy plan and getting people trying to talk people into signing on to it. It's not bad to create a big coalition, but it doesn't really get to the core of the of the matter over time. So the field needs all different sets of ways of collaborating, but I think this is one that really promises to be very effective, and I think it has been. Recently, the National Affordable Housing Trust had a retreat, and this is like a year and a half ago, and all the members came together around an idea that they would each commit to put properties in a couple of $100 million funds, so that they could be in effect marketed as the safe community developers, and NAHT was able to get $200 million investors to step up, and this was kind of like a new idea, because previously they try to raise the money and then they try to place it, but this was an evolution. So the co-creation process goes on, and if you can build that initial trust, select the people right, and then build the initial trust, you can really do a lot more. I'm part of something called the Well-Being Project, whose idea is to change the culture of social change organizations to support the personal well-being of the leaders and staff. And it's also a co-creation, in this case of Ashoka, where I served on the board for 20 years, Skoll, which also finds and supports social entrepreneurs, Esalen, which is a premier retreat center, and a couple of others, and everybody brings something different to the table. Our co-creation team is forever innovating, and it's really focused on helping people, change makers in the social sector, have better lives, and it's really quite remarkable how that's caught on. But we now have a learning group that has a whole bunch of the world's biggest foundations in it. We've got a university group with 10 global universities. We've got a joint venture think tank with Georgetown University. We've got a lot of different initiatives underway, but only really because co-creation process of like-minded but not identical people has produced so many good ideas. So I'm a real fan of it. It takes time. I mean, it takes building that trust. You can't just sort of organize it and have a meeting and take votes. You have to really get on top of it. So,
what do you feel is the biggest challenge in the housing and communities arena that we're facing today?
Well, I would say we've got a whole lot of challenges, and there's a constant problem of getting enough resources, and we, as you know, and anybody in the field knows, we're only serving a quarter of the income eligible people with a combination of Section 8 and public housing. So we're really not meeting the need, and because it isn't a universal benefit, it also generates a lot of these cross-field problems that I was talking about earlier. So I think that attracting resources is on the top of the list all the time, but I think we really need to look at the role of the housing sector in systemic racism in a more focused and stronger way, and so I think that's a big issue, and certainly for historical reasons as well as current ones. The housing sector has caused a lot of the problems we face today, and it's incumbent on the housing sector to do its piece in trying to unravel some of that, and it's going to be really long and hard. Another, I think, is what we've already talked about, which is the integration across fields and an attempt to make housing a stronger platform for people to lead better lives. And then, I wouldn't ever leave preservation off a list, because it's been so hard and expensive and so on to create the programs that we and the housing that has come out of the programs, and to let that languish or let that be converted to a different use, I think is nearly criminal. So we have to really keep bearing down on that. Tax credit housing alone without a tenant subsidy doesn't serve the lowest income people, and so we just can't lose what we have. We need to keep our heads around that. I'm seeing regularly offers to sell Section 8 based housing at what looked to me to be really outrageously high prices, and I think they're being sold to people generally who don't know housing, and they're being basically sold as if it's a federal bond with a certain coupon, and then there's a kind of general expectation of making a profit on the back end as well. And the investors are not people that generally that care about affordable housing, and we're going to lose that housing as soon as it turns out that a local market is strong enough to charge higher rents to after some kind of rehab. So we really need to bear down on that. And then clearly there's the neighborhood element, and we have to rebuild and build vibrant and safe neighborhoods, and that ties back in, I think, to the systemic racism issues, and it ties into a lot of, and it also ties into this sort of housing as a platform. If you have a vibrant neighborhood, you can develop programs that serve the people inside the properties as well as the other people in the community. So I think those are really that's my list. It could go on for another 15 items, but that's what I think about every day.
With the current environment, what do you dream of for the future?
Well, it's this is the time when we need dreams, and so I dream of vibrant communities with everybody who needs the rental assistance, having access to it, and enabling them to help reinforce the communities they live in, and for those who are able to do so to climb into a higher economic category.
And my last question is, What advice do you have for the younger generation? And I'm talking about people in their early 20s.
Right. Well, I talk to lots and lots of those people because friends of mine, apart from having my own contacts in the housing world, any friend of mine who has a son or daughter who is interested in the field, or whose son or daughter has a friend who's interested in the field, sends me an email, gives me a call. So I get a chance to do this a lot, and I believe people should develop. People that are interested in this field should develop a strong suit skill of some kind, so that they're have a place at the table, early in their careers, but have a diversified experiences so that they can bring a combination of a strong suit and some comprehension of the other issues that are entailed in housing and community development at the same time. And then they can, whether that's going to law school or business school or public policy school, whether it's doing that right away out of college, or thinking that you want to work someplace for a couple of years and to get a sense of it before you plunge into the academic side, I think doesn't matter. It sort of depends on the person's personal financial situation and direction. But I think there are lots of opportunities. I'm seeing a lot of, and as compared with, say, 15 years ago, I'm seeing a lot of senior people, retiring at something like a conventional retirement age instead of holding on till they're, in the grave. And so the opportunities then, float down through the system. And I'm also seeing people, I see it particularly within the SAFE community, actually, really good people going from one role in one developer to another, maybe more senior role in a second developer, sort of movement around within the SAFE membership community. And I think that's really very healthy, and it's I guess I won't say that that it's not discouraged. It's probably discouraged off and on, but it's tolerated and on the part of management, and it's really effective, I think. So I'm hopeful that that'll happen more and more, and that the kinds of collaborations I'm talking about will generate more and more of that.
Well, Bill, you've been so great just to tell us some details of things that we get an overview and a big picture of, but we don't always have the depth of the knowledge that you've had. Appreciate that. And the second thing I appreciate is that you've introduced us to this co-creation model, and then looking at it for social change and tying it in, thinking about how can we get a much larger collaboration going than we have had in the past, because we have tended to work in silos, especially as it relates to HUD and low-income housing. So I think that you're broadening into other areas is an extremely important concept.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And thank you so much for conducting this interview.
You are welcome. And we wish you much success in all these ongoing endeavors that you've got going on.
Okay, well, thank you.